Welcome and thank you for joining us. I'm thrilled and honored to moderate today's session titled Black Women in Forestry in the 21st Century. I am Jasmine Brown and I am a forestry doctoral student at Michigan State University. My work focuses on the history of African Americans in forestry. I would say I'm fully aware of the weight and significance of me being a Black woman that's in a forestry PhD program. Actually, the National Science Foundation ended up publishing a study where they said that 0 PhDs were awarded to African Americans in forestry in the year 2019. So I am humbled and honored to be at this point in my life and also to be leading this session. During this session, we intend to share stories of lived experiences and to share gifts. We have a 45-minute discussion planned with 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. Feel free to provide comments and questions in the chat box. Next, I will let each of our amazing and phenomenal panelists briefly introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about their backgrounds.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mavis Gragg. I am the director of the Sustainable Forestry and African American Land Retention Project. My connection or work in forestry is relatively new, as I actually practiced law before in the real estate space. But I'm very excited to be here and to discuss Black women in forestry with all of you.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you, Jasmine, for moderating. I'm Beattra Wilson with U.S. Forest Service. Excited to be here. I'm the Assistant Director of Cooperative Forestry, where I have the joy of overseeing the nation's urban and community forestry program. I have been in the Forest Service 20 years, and I'm a proud urban forestry grad alum of Southern University. And I'm really excited about your doctorate program, Jasmine. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Brenda Richardson. I am an eco-feminist here in Washington, D.C. I'm also a member of the Friends of Oxen Run Park, and I also sit on D.C.'s Urban Forestry Council with the District of Columbia's Department of Transportation. And I'm delighted to be here and always so grateful to see young people being so actively engaged. We love you, Jasmine.
Thank you all for the love that you're sharing and for those awesome introductions. To start today's panel, I will read an excerpt from Carolyn Finney's piece titled "The Space Between the Words." The links to the piece will be available at the end of today's session. When I think about the woods and picture myself breathing with the trees and catching sunlight between the leaves, I am always a brown-skinned woman, carrying the weight of my ancestors while dreaming about a future possible. Our role as storytellers demands a kind of going into the woods of our own assumptions. Whether we are talking about the forest, a single tree, or our human presence, how that story comes alive relies on our ability to engage and embrace those expressions of lived difference. So with that, it made me realize how every time I enter the woods, I know that my ancestors are with me. I know that I carry the trauma and their triumphs that they experienced in the forest in these natural settings. With this in mind, I wanted to start our discussion off with the historical connections between African Americans and forest, in forest and with forests. We know that forests played a multidimensional role in the lives of African Americans and still do. When we're thinking about this story, we realize that there's chapters that talk about racial terror, that talk about trauma, but we also realize that events such as worship, spiritual events, and religious ceremonies also took place in the woods. The forest also acted as a place of escape. I also wanted to share that trees tell stories too. So for the first question, I wanted to ask our panelists, what stories do you have to share about the weight of your ancestors and their historical connections to nature.
Hi, Jasmine. Thank you. And I get us started, and I'll speak about my experience. I'm from rural Louisiana, and I grew up where both of my parents at some point attended segregated grade schools. And I grew up in a very rural area that was surrounded by pine forest. And what was unique is that one of the main economic factors or drivers in my small town was a plywood plant, a sawmill. And to know that my dad, who worked at that mill, and two of my brothers work there today, there was not a lot of land ownership by Black people in my community. And so as I grew up in this rural town and a very avid 4-H'er, I always kept thinking about I looked for the connection to the business of forestry, where there was the dependency on the mill, on the labor side, for the income of the working class. And then there was also the land ownership and the private hunting clubs, for example, that did not exist on the Black side, in the Black community. And so that was my earliest interest, and I would say inquiry into forestry. And as I had an opportunity to pursue college, urban forestry was the degree program that I ended up going into, not necessarily knowing where it would take me, but knowing that my focus was always on the business side, and how could the Black community be closer to land ownership, and how could I be part of making that possible? And so although I navigated into urban forestry, it still manifests itself in urban communities today. Think about how I think about the value of green space right now in a social distancing environment, and how important it is to have that patch of grass or that natural space to recreate for mental health, and how if you don't have it, the disparity and the health impacts of not having access. And so that's been my connection to forestry. And so when you talk about a tree, sometimes that's what I have to do in urban forestry. But my rural roots remind me every day as to why I got into this, and what is that driver? How can I be part of making either land ownership or in urban spaces access to green space available for people of color equitably, so everyone can enjoy it.
Thank you, Beattra and Jasmine. I think for me, my experience has been very different. So grateful for the experience that I have, and so grateful for our ancestors. But I think from my perspective, it's not just about a forest, but it's about the trees in cities. And from my experience, in a disfavored community, trees are often seen as things that are very threatening, only because a person can be hiding around behind a tree and hurt you. I live in a community where people can hide their drugs around or in a tree if a tree happens to have a hole in it. And I think that one of the things that I'm very, very mindful of is that when communities that are disinherited are struggling with trauma and exhaustion, their perception of green space and forest is very, very different. So one of the reasons that I'm very, very grateful to be so involved with, as a Black woman in forestry, is having the opportunity to not only educate our disfavored communities, but also to connect them to nature and to forest and to trees, because considering where we are at this unprecedented time in our history, I think there's great value in trees and helping us to heal and helping us to improve our mental health.
As I mentioned earlier, my foray into forestry professionally only started recently, but that actually made me think back to when I was growing up. I grew up in the country, so to speak. I grew up in rural Western North Carolina, And my family was one of few families, Black families, that actually owned where we lived, but we had small parcels. So it wasn't like we had big pieces of land with trees on it that were considered forests. And the time that we spent a lot of time in nature, again, thinking back, you know, we used to walk to school and we had to literally go through a forest to get to school. But for me, I was going to school. It wasn't that I was walking through a forest. And when my family actually went to the forest, like Pisgah National Forest, which is one of the big forests near my hometown, that was family time. You know, we didn't call it hiking. Hiking was for rich white people. It wasn't, there was no connection to the term hiking. Camping was reserved for Girl Scout camp. It wasn't something that we, like, because I actually think, you know, camping within our own family time was viewed as surviving, not a recreation, so to speak. And so my orientation was very different despite growing up in a rural area. And I think a lot of our outdoor activities and connection with land was perceived as being country, you know, as apart from, as distinguished from our city cousins, those cousins who migrated to the north during the Great Migration. So it's only been recently that I've really started to think intentionally about what it means to be engaged with nature. And, you know, going back to what Beattra was saying in terms of ownership, you know, my career has focused on helping families who are land rich, cash poor. And it never occurred to me that forestry is a way to increase wealth. And when I heard that Black people own forests, I was like, whoa, wow, that's amazing. Like, to me, it almost seems like magical that we own forests. But of course we own forests, because if you have land with trees, it's a forest. So.
Thank you all for sharing. I was smiling and nodding the whole time because I connected with everything that was said. It definitely made me reflect on my connections to nature too. I know that when I shared with my grandmother that I was going into forestry, her instant reaction was fear. She said, absolutely not. I would never go back in the woods. I have no interest in taking a walk with you. There's nothing that you can show me that I haven't already seen. So it had me really realize everyone has their own individual connection to nature, but that there still is that historical trauma that could be attached to it, and how that may impact or shape or frame the way that someone could potentially connect with forests. So thank you all for sharing on that first segment. For the next segment, I wanted to explore the unique experiences of Black women in the woods and the many ways that we show up, whether that is as a forestry professional, whether that is as someone who just loves trees, who is talking to someone about the benefits of trees, or whether that's someone who's working with landowners. Thinking of ways to navigate and succeed in the work that we do while continuing to be our authentic selves. Can you share a story about the way your identity informs the work that you do, or how you approach your area of expertise? Brenda, we can let you go first.
So, you know, that's a really, really interesting question, because I guess as I sit here today, I recognize that I am Black, but when I'm doing my work, I'm just doing my work. I think for me, I always recognize that I'm an eco-feminist before I am anything else. So I'm really, really intrigued by this conversation. And I'll share a couple of quick stories, if I may. So I've recently started engaging in forest bathing. And there is this amazing woman, Melanie Chokus Bradley, here in the district, who took me on my first forest bathing. She guided us on a forest bathing walk. And it was one of the most extraordinary experiences I've had. There is this beautiful swath of land in my community, Ward 8, called Oxen Cove, that a lot of us don't even know about. It's like a hidden treasure. And the notion of being able to walk and feel safe, and I must emphasize walk in this area and feel safe, and then have Melanie say, stop, and because what forest bathing is about is smelling, touching, seeing and hearing. And it was just an extraordinary experience. You guys, I was cloud watching. Have you ever watched the clouds from above the tree canopy? It's just a really magnificent experience. And after I had that first forest bathing experience, it was my intention to get as many people from our disfavored community in the forest as often and as quickly as I can, because we're going through so much right now. And somebody said to me that the pandemic has robbed us of our health and our wealth. Well, the forest is free. The parks are free. And I'm just very, very grateful that I was able to have this extraordinary experience and be able to share it with others.
Thank you. Thank you, Brenda. And can I add on, Jasmine, that, Brenda set me up because in the spaces I work in and have an opportunity to have oversight of, urban forests, it's just like she said, they're free, right? But if they don't exist, and that's who I'm always thinking about, those communities who perhaps have been underinvested in, or their green space isn't equitably, their canopy cover isn't equitably delivered as it may perhaps be on another side of town, in another ward, for example. And so we have this tremendous tailwind of an opportunity right now where there is the priorities and focuses that I've been handed here as a federal employee and public servant. This season of my service is about racial equity, social justice, climate adaptation, and things being done. And we are really focusing on vulnerable communities and being more thoughtful, not about where we are comfortable, the spaces we're comfortable working in, but perhaps getting uncomfortable, rolling up our sleeves, meeting new partners, making new friends, doing what we have to do and using what we have access to make these green and park or nature experiences possible for everyone to enjoy. So that's the space I'm showing up in forestry, in urban forestry. But your question, Jasmine, kind of talks about the experience being a Black woman. And so I sit here in the US Forest Service, where I know that demographic-wise on diversity, Black women are less than 2% of this 30,000 employee organization. And so my voice is a voice that is perhaps, it shows up less in rooms, but I also believe that representation matters. And so I don't hesitate to put my values in the room because, again, we've heard Brenda, Mavis, yourself, Jasmine, the readings of Carolyn Finney. I think about those who came before me in the Forest Service who've been senior leaders, those like Gloria Brown, who've shared her story. Those, I think of the person who I admire who taught me the business of federal administration and how to be more thoughtful and think about set-asides and think about all the creative ways we as federal administrators can meet the needs of communities regardless of where they are. And that's Robin Thompson, who I worked with in my entire career in state and private forestry. And then I also think about that other 1.4% of Black women in the agency who may not be foresters, who may not be conservationists, but they may show up in the space of administrative assistants, office managers, budget analysts, grant administrators. I think it's my nature as a Black woman, a Black person coming from a mother who was one of 11 in a small rural community where everybody helped each other out. It's, again, when I said learning the business of how to make sure everybody has access, I think it's taken me, my network in my agency is a collective of all of these people in all of these roles and all of the spaces and all of the access they hold. And so as a Black woman in forestry, I feel like I'm stronger and more capable of helping because of all those around me. They may not be urban foresters or credentialed or certified foresters or arborists, but I think they all play an important role of how we get the resources that are federally provided and everybody is supposed to have access to and how they get them. And so that's been my experience as a Black woman in forestry. And then also just, again, representation, not hesitating to make myself available for anyone who is interested in knowing that forestry is an opportunity or a career option for a Black woman.
As far as my identity goes, I will say that some of my top values align well with working in forestry. So curiosity, inner peace, relationships, service. Another one of my top values is justice. And I think that that's something that I am able to bring to the space through my work, because my work is social justice oriented, even though it's a forestry program. You know, it's sustainable forestry and African American land retention, but it's very much a social impact initiative. And so all of those things I've been able to find in this space, whereas I didn't find it in the traditional legal space. You know, being curious, being open. And I've found everyone that I've encountered in the forestry space to be very curious, to be very friendly, and the very nature of our work is service oriented. So I think that helps, even, you know, notwithstanding the diversity of forestry. I hope, as a Black woman in forestry, that I can encourage other Black women and other people of color to consider this space. Forestry is such a huge industry. Conservation is so critical to our own resiliency. So we need more diversity in this space. And so I hope that by me being here, that I'm opening the doors for others to be here as well. You asked for some anecdotes or some stories. I did want to share real quickly. I used to teach at a law school at a HBCU. And one day I took my class on a hike. And it was so surprising to me. Like, they were so playful. Law students, if you don't know law students tend to be kind of type A and very rigid. And the students were singing Disney songs or songs from their childhood, etc. They were so playful. And I asked them, you know, why, you know, what was it about this experience? And they said that they hadn't been outside or like in the woods since they were kids. And these were mostly Black students. And I thought, dang, that's really striking that you feel like it's an activity reserved for when you are young and playful, and not something that you can do as an adult, or that you should do as an adult. Going back to Brenda's point, the therapeutic values of just being present in the trees and just looking up. You know, how often do we just look up? So yeah.
Thank you all for your stories. I connected to each one. Brenda, I actually also went forest bathing with Melanie, and it was a mind-blowing experience. I felt so centered. I felt very at peace, and I don't think I had ever walked through the woods that way, thinking and smelling and feeling and thinking about the texture of trees. I've never had that, so it almost made me realize all the times I have walked through the forest and missed something. All the times when I was not completely at peace or maybe present in my body. So I always think about the therapeutic effects of nature. I know for sure that when I'm thinking about representation, for me, a lot of times when I run into people, they'll be excited that I'm in this field, but then ask, hey, can you leave the Black part at home? Can you, not the Afro, not today, not the proud Black girl. And I make sure that that is me. And every time I show up, every space, every decision that I'm making, from my outfit to my hair, is intentional. I'm letting you know that this is me, and this is how I will show up in the classroom, in my work, when I'm speaking. So it's just thinking about how important it is to be your authentic self in everything that you do. Yes, representation matters. I think about the times when I've been speaking to the public, possibly dressed up in my Forester uniform, and I've had a little Black girl run up to me and say, oh, I can do this too. Yes, you can. Just knowing that you see that one person who looks like you, and that can suddenly encourage you to consider a career or just a hobby that you never ever thought you'd do. So just thinking about the weight of your stories, I'm holding them very close to my heart, and I'm so excited just to hear and learn more. Circling back to my opening comments, we know that African Americans have a multidimensional relationship to forests and with trees. With this in mind, we have to realize that not everyone sees the forest as a therapeutic, safe, and healing space. Can you each talk about a program or activity that you're involved with that's designed to create new relationships or transform existing ones between African Americans and forests?
I'll go first. Thank you for that question, Jasmine. And I'm just so inspired by your enthusiasm. I'm so glad that you're here. There are a couple of things that I want to share as it relates to that. One of the things that we're doing here in the District of Columbia is working with folks who've lost their loved ones and starting a memory forest. And it's been a really heartwarming kind of experience. I remember when we did the first one in Oxen Run Park, and I have to give kudos to urban forestry because of the district government, no less. Urban forestry and DPR, our Department of Parks and Recreation, because they are thinking outside of the box. And there were 8 women who had lost a loved one to gun violence, and we planted a tree for each one of their loved ones. It was such a very moving experience, but it's like that tree has life now as a result of being connected not only to that family, but connecting that family to nature. The other thing I want to share that we're doing is we're working on outdoor learning in our park, in Oxen Run Park. We've got this beautiful sort of a mini forest, and this amphitheater sits right in the middle. And you guys, I am just so thrilled to see all these little kids. We have a wiggle into spring where we're going to teach the kids about worms and how they're valuable to the earth. And it's just a joy to see our community being showered with favor by having the opportunity to experience joy and connect to nature and not be exhausted. The last 2 things I will share is that African Americans are making a concerted effort to improve the tree canopy in our community. It's so fascinating to me that the tree canopy on the west side of the city is robust, but the tree canopy on the east side of the city needs a lot of improvement. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to have the Ward 8 Tree Challenge, where we're thinking of creative ways to get folks to plant trees in their own backyard. And then the last thing I'll share is, do you guys know that you can plant trees with police officers and have a great time? So we've had the opportunity to do that as well. We have these police cadets who get to come into our park, work with our community, and help us plant these tree groves. And it's just been a wonderful, enlightening experience. So why am I saying that? Whether you're Black, whether you're white, there is always an opportunity for us to improve our forest. And I think the other thing real quickly, Jasmine, that I want to say is that I will be so grateful for the day when we are appreciated for who we are. And I was really struck, Jasmine, by what you said about leave the Afro at home. That's just so unsettling to me, because this is who we are. This is what we look like, but we're just as brilliant and fabulous as everybody else. I'm very, very grateful to be here with all 4 of you, because I feel even more empowered to be in the presence of such amazing women, Mavis, Beattra, and Jasmine, because I'm inspired to do more. Thank you.
Brenda, I have a follow-up question for you, because I think that those programs you describe are amazing. Were they initiated and driven by Black people? Because I think that that's a distinction that should be made, as opposed to when white organizations come into communities that have tree canopies that need to be improved. Could you talk about that part? Like, what do you think makes that successful? And is there any connection to the fact that it's driven by Black people?
Well, I think number one, that Black people were sitting at the table to help with the creation and the planning of it. And number two, you know, our communities are all very different, and you can't prescribe the same thing to every Black community. It doesn't work that way. So I'm grateful that as a Black woman, I had the opportunity to be creative based on what I know about my community and what will work in my community. And government and our other partners have been very, very open to doing that because it's working. Thank you, Mavis.
Mm-hmm. Beattra, you want to go? Okay.
Sure, I'll follow on to what Brenda's saying because I'm a huge fan of the Brenda Richardsons across America, right? And this is, again, it goes back to how we show up and what happens when we have access to leadership and decision-making positions and budgets and policy. And when we're at the table, but we also have this pipeline of access, right? And so Brenda knows what her community needs and what her community wants. And so the days of the excuses or the barriers of, oh, we don't have a relationship in that community, the tree planting program won't sustain, for example, we're having those conversations in urban and community forestry right now with my colleagues and my partners. And it's all about, we have to meet the community where they are. We have to go in and we have to gain trust. We don't come in trusted just because we have a polo on with a crest in the corner of it. We need to go in and we need to find the Brenda Richardsons and have a lot of conversations before she's ready to introduce us to her community. And so I'm always thinking with this ear and this lens of vulnerability and also empathy, because I know you have a canopy cover need in your ward, but I also have to be okay with just showing up with fruit trees because you also don't have a grocery store for a 2-mile radius, right? And so the quality of life and improving their living conditions in these communities to make them more sustainable. I think that's another piece of what Brenda doesn't realize. She's touching on it, but that's all what this work is about with regard to forestry and green space, is when there has been such systemic underinvestment and intentional uninvestment due to policies that were designed and policies that have been perpetuated over time by those who have been okay with just implementation. The story and the opportunity for impact, as Mavis mentions, impact is really truly crawling and getting into spaces and meeting and having these relationships with the Brendas across the country. And so having the opportunity to show up in the Forest Service, again, I went to a land grant agricultural HBCU. And so I know from a historical perspective, how much innovation and opportunity comes off of those campuses. Those 19 universities anchor us in agriculture, in conservation, in environmental decision making, right? And so as this next generation comes up, who's just as interested in climate and just as interested in land ownership or farming, organic farming, urban agriculture, whatever it may be, I feel it's my responsibility 20 years into my career coming off those campuses to do my part in not just thinking about great ideas, but funding great ideas, making sure they're executed and they're attended. And so whether it's diversity in wildfire and letting our young people know that they can have successful careers in wildfire, not just fighting the fires, but perhaps on the aviation side, right? And the ecology side and making those decisions. Environmental justice. I know in conservation agencies and organizations, we like to call it NEPA work, right? Community engagement is community engagement. And if these young people are asking for environmental justice training, then we'll just call it environmental justice. We're going to meet them where they're interested to make sure we engage them and meet their needs. And the same goes for the conversation around workforce and the lack of diversity in these green and conservation careers. I think a lot has been said for the organizations who continue to train and introduce and expose our young people to green space, to conservation, to green jobs. But there's also a tremendous opportunity for us to do more work in the retention side of maintaining these young people in these green and conservation jobs. And so not going beyond training and thinking about retention. And I have probably said this 3 times this week, and it's only Thursday, but I am pressing on folks to think about ending these exposure experiences, especially with our young people with jobs, in a W-4 experience. Are they actually getting a living wage benefits job at the end of the training experience? And so again, my lens and my introduction and my experience in forestry is different. And it's not textbook knowledge, it's my own testimony that is really driving me to challenge and be more disruptive in spaces that perhaps have become very comfortable to implement the work we do in forestry. But I think there's an opportunity for us to go further and be in the space of impact.
I will say that my program, or not my program, the program I have the honor of working with, the Sustainable Forestry and African American Land Retention Project, has had a tremendous impact on connecting Black people with woodlands, very intentionally, because, you know, everyone is getting engaged in education, but they're also getting forest management plans. They are getting support from USDA to implement practices on the ground. They're becoming advocates. You know, they're providing input into the Farm Bill. A lot of times we don't think about the Farm Bill in connection with forestry, but it all falls under there. So I think that program has been pretty phenomenal, a very innovative approach to connecting people with land in that way. What's interesting to me is that the program has been around for 9 years, and recently we've been thinking about this as a conservation initiative, not just a forestry initiative, not just a keep Black land in the Black community initiative, but it truly is having a conservation impact, which I think will be interesting in terms of how we communicate the story of the program and encourage other African Americans and other communities of color to connect more deeply with their woodlands. So I think that's exciting. And then on a personal level, my sister and I founded Black Women Drone with the idea of creating a community of women, Black women and girls who are curious, who just want to, you know, break barriers early on. You know, droning technology is rapidly evolving, but it is relatively new. And there's also Black Men Drone. And at least my personal hope with that is that we can use that as a vehicle to, pun intended, to help people see their land, to see the trees, to see how incredible it is. The view from way up above is pretty phenomenal. And so that's one of the hopes that I have, that it can actually help people feel more connected to woodlands, and see the value of them differently.
Thank you for sharing a little bit about your programs. We were receiving some questions about specific programs, so I'm sure we will get to them shortly. I know a lot of times when I hear people talk about the lack of diversity in environmental fields and natural resources, one thing I typically like to bring up is the history of exclusion, that we typically did not have access to these programs or to these spaces. So we can't suddenly wake up in 2021 and then ask, oh my gosh, now I want people of color in this field. First of all, it wasn't up to you. And then second of all, we've already been here. Whether or not we were welcomed, embraced, or retained, that's a different story. That's another question. But it's always thinking about the historical context of, if you're looking at demographics of a field, you can't just look at it. It's not a microcosm. It does not exist in a vacuum. You have to think about the history of these long-term policies of systemic exclusion and racism that impact. This is the way that our field looks like today. This is as a result of that. So let me see. I am checking the time now. In closing, we offer you all one more gift. A nature poem by Langston Hughes titled For Russell and Rowena Jelliffe. And so the seed becomes a flower, and in its hour reproduces dreams and flowers.
And so the root becomes the trunk and then a tree, and seeds of trees and springtime sap and summer shade and autumn leaves and shape of poems and dreams more than a tree.
And so it is with those who make of life a flower, a tree, a dream, reproducing on into its own and mine and your infinity, its beauty and its life in you and me.
And so it was, and is with you, the seed, the flower, the root, the tree, the dream, the you.
This poem I make from poems you made for you. Thank you for joining us. I will now be addressing the questions we've received in the chat box. One question that we have so far is, what does the panel think is the best way to introduce connections to the land to Black communities so far removed from forestry?
I mean, this is very simple, but there's a gentleman, Alan Bell, who's on the board of directors at the Land Trust Alliance, and he participates in a program with young kids at a school, especially when we're in urban areas. How often do we look up and appreciate what is around us and even think about what is around us? So that's something simple, just taking micro opportunities to connect with nature. It doesn't have to be that you have to go outside the city or far from your home. Just observing what is around you and being present with it.
Jasmine, can I add to Mavis? And a little bit of it is around the tone of also the spirit of belonging and knowing that we all have an opportunity and we all should feel like we belong in the outdoors and nature. And despite what the past, whether it's the positive or the negative side of our past has brought us. And then I also like to offer up prosperity. I think as the next generation with such an entrepreneurial spirit, one of the things young people have brought over and over, and I love the ideas they bring, a lot of it is ways that they can regain, rebuild, or create generational wealth. And a lot of that is in the land. And as we see more and more stories about families pooling together resources to buy large swatches of land and resettle and build that sense of community where they have all the decision making and control, I think that's another moment and an opportunity that we don't want to miss when we look for opportunities to engage folks around returning to green space and forestry.
I'd like to follow up on Beattra. I think we have to be intentional in our planning, socially, economically, physically, medically. And I say medically because here in the District of Columbia, there's a Parks RX program where doctors can actually give you a prescription to take a walk in the park. And I think that in light of the health disparities in communities of color, that taking a walk in a park can help to not only save our lives, but reduce a lot of those health disparities. And I look at all the money that's being funneled into our communities to improve our health, when again, as Beattra said, the park is free, the forest is free. But I think that the big issue is that Black folks have to feel comfortable walking in our parks, knowing that I'm going to take a walk, I could lose 5 pounds and my blood pressure is going to go down. I can take a walk and I'm going to reduce my diabetes numbers. And I can take a walk and my mental health my spirit will be reignited as a result of my mental health. But I think we have to be intentional in our planning in order to connect more of us to nature and to our forests.
Thank you. I'll read another question. Could trees help tell the stories of Black history and experiences? The National Park Service has a long-standing Witness Trees program, in parentheses, old trees still standing as silent sentinels. Any advice on how the National Park Service could reimagine that program to be more inclusive?
I would, Jasmine, real quickly, I would offer the thoughts around historic preservation. And there is a real history around the retreat under a shade tree, especially for a labor pool that is working out in the heat in the direct sun all day long. And I come from Southern University, which sits on the bluff of the Mississippi River. And to think about those historic oaks. And although the university is part of a historic preservation district, the buildings are declared as historically preserved by the National Historic Preservation Council. However, those trees, without those trees lining the streets, those majestic oaks. And so I think there's an opportunity to pull in an environmental component as we think about historic preservation and what our culture and many Black people, what we include in our memories and what we think and what memories we preserve and where we found strength and opportunity. I think there's as much of an opportunity for green spaces, historic trees, and then not just think about the history, but the future. I think about tree planting opportunities to carve out a story to tell the next generation. Imagine a kindergarten class watching a small patch of trees mature up until they're high schoolers, but also imagine if they're the ones maintaining those trees, right? And so I think there's two ways we can go with this. We can preserve the history, but also I think there's enough need for us to engage that next generation and think through where we can be building out some hope and some aspiration stories too.
Beattra, you're so good. I just love that. And I think, you know, what you made me realize is that the trees unite us, the forests unite us. But when I think about the local side of trees and the federal side of trees, there's this sense of separatism. So how do we create a marriage so that our local trees and our federal trees are all united? Because when I think about, you know, when I think about trees based on the question, I think about how when somebody was murdered, they will put teddy bears or liquor bottles by the tree where that person was killed. And I think that this opportunity that we have right now is to strengthen the possibility of a marriage between the federal side of trees and the local side of trees. So we can all, I think it will help us too, you know, from a racism perspective, no more separatism, but uniting us on that front as well. Does that make sense, Mavis?
I think so.
Well, I will just go in since you said Beattra, Brenda. I will. I'm you know I'm from the country, and so have you ever heard the saying you can't see the forest for the trees? Mm-hmm. And so we keep thinking about what's on. We gotta deal with what a person in an urban community, for example, sees every day. And if there is nothing in your right of way, in that cutout block, I mean, there's an opportunity there. What you talk about, the people who place teddy bears and bottles around trees to memorial. What happens if they don't have a tree? And that's the question I continue to press on my colleagues who are experts and who are trained in this space. Let's not just focus on where there are trees. Let's think about the possibilities and reimagine the forest that doesn't exist, the forested spaces. And so what, you know, thinking through Mavis's program, and Mavis, we'll have to talk offline. I'm really intrigued by the droning for women, thinking about, imagine if you could go up and hover over, and you could take your drone from the District of Columbia over to Prince George's County and perhaps down to Charles County and keep going. You know, we don't have a national forest in the state of Maryland, but if you go a little further down, right, you will see from a much more elevated level. Think about when you're in an airplane, right? So when I think about opportunity and access and possibility, it's just a matter of us getting down to the ground and doing the work. You know, it's more peaceful up there because it looks like we're all, you know, there's some unity. But when you get closer and closer and you start seeing the gaps and you start digging a little deeper and uncovering why the gaps are there, I think that's where the work can be done.
With that, it had me kind of think of my experience growing up. There's also no national forest in the state of Connecticut where I'm from. So I had no idea that the Forest Service existed, let alone, again, that forestry was a career opportunity. So I remember the first time I told my maternal grandmother that I was going into a forest. She was like, a tree island, you know, those things on the road. Is it like a strip of trees? And I was like, no, imagine a group of trees. She was like, 3? No. So literally trying to use words to explain, like, Nana, this is what a forest, like, you know, the thing you pass on the highway. I'm trying to use words that I wasn't taught in school to explain, like, this is what a forest is. I'm not going to tell you what I do there because that's another conversation, but this is what a forest looks like. This is something that you can experience too. So it's just realizing that the language that we use definitely will impact that conversation. If I came to her and used all these technical terms that would have went right over her head, I'm not talking to her, I'm talking at her. I'm talking down to her. And that is not my intention at all. And I know that's something I've had to learn in forestry. The first day I learned what an acre was, my mind was blown. I was like, how many city blocks is 1 acre? How many boulevards, how many main streets? I had no idea. So I was just thinking about the terms that you might have in your discipline or every day at work do not always easily translate when you're connecting with people, when you're talking to members of the public. And if you're thinking about community engagement and recruitment, for example, though, that should exactly be one of your goals, is how are we making sure that we're communicating to our audience? Because then you have to ask, who is our audience? It can't just be us. Amongst ourselves, I can use whatever language I want. But if the goal is understanding and comprehension, well, then I know that I have to get on your level and stay there and make sure that we're seeing eye to eye. You see, we had one question that's received a lot of votes from Bernadette. My forest project is in a park that has had a history of racist philanthropists, naming it Robert E. Lee Park, now named Roland Park, in a primarily Black city, Baltimore. Does addressing this history help invite minority students at my university to participate, or might it limit their interest?
I will say, I think there's all the opportunity in the world. I think when it comes to ownership of, especially if this is a public space, a public park, I think we all have the freedom to make this spot, this place, this geographic point on the map, what we want it to be. And so if I understand the question correctly, it has already been renamed from Robert E. Lee to Roland, right? And I think that's a journey young people are not shying away from right now. They want to see where oppression has shifted towards progress, and there's own leadership has been at the table to make that happen. So I think there's a hope opportunity in that, and I don't think they would shy away from it at all. I say go and have tours, and if anything, maybe listen to some of the stories as they go through the experience, and pay attention to the questions they ask. This new generation, especially if they're college students, they're probably going to ask you tougher questions than you think your storytelling may be as you take them through the history of the park.
And there's also an opportunity to talk about the sustainability of the park and community investment in the sustainability of the park. You mentioned that the park was largely supported by a racist philanthropist. It sounds like there's now an opportunity for the community to provide support, and they have the opportunity to frame what that looks like. You know, a lot of times philanthropy is inaccessible to many of us, and we can change that. So definitely history plays a role.
And I think that's a great question, because I find that a lot of times folks in disfavored communities don't realize that parks belong to them too. And it's important for us as a people of color to be visible and to be present in our parks, so that other people in our community will understand that it belongs to us too. It belongs to all of us. Thank you for that question.
I was going to read our last question, but we are out of time. So with that, I will at least acknowledge that we have a giant among us who is watching this session. Melody Mobley had posted a question regarding the number of Black women in forestry, and she was actually hired as the first Black professional forester in the Forest Service in 1977. The first Black woman as a forester. I fangirl when I think about her. She's definitely one of my mentors for sure. So I will be sure to respond to your question, Melody, but we are not able to right now. I will wrap up this session. Thank you all for joining us. We look forward to continuing to connect with you on this platform and to attend the following sessions. I am so honored to have had this awesome panel. Thank you for sharing your stories, for bringing yourself to this space. And also thank you, audience, for engaging with us by posting questions and your comments in the chat. I've been trying to compose myself as I'm reading some of them. Jen apparently is following me into battle and I'm with it, come on. So I really, really appreciate all the comments and feedback. I'll be responding to stuff throughout the day. But thank you so much for engaging. Thank you so much for attending. And we really, really appreciate your presence.
Thank you, Jasmine.
Thank you, Jasmine.
and
Great
Brenda.
job.
Bye, y'all.